Really hope this works this time. Finally, I'm going to tackle a detailed camera settings video. I've got this Canon EOS-R recording to an external recorder, the menu and the screen and all those options. Another EOS-R recording this actual video. We'll see how this goes, but hopefully you can get a detailed sense of exactly what I'm experiencing through the viewfinder and a variety of scenarios. So this is going to subtly differ with any camera and system that you're using, but even if you don't have these specific cameras, it should translate well to most modern DSLRs and even Nikon or Fuji or other systems completely. They're just going to have different names and different limitations or even better implementations depending on the system that you're using. Right out of the box, I was concerned with a few different features with these cameras. So I've got a little test model here and just put them in front of me so I have something to focus on. There we go. Great. Right out of the box, one of the biggest, and if you watch the previous video from my workshops, I pointed this out, but one of the biggest things that I love and is sort of critical to me as a photographer is having the focus point be the center uppermost point consistently. So it should always go back to that, right? And you can see as I focus on this little dummy, no matter where it tracks and no matter where it goes, it ends up being always returning to that center uppermost point. I'm just going to go through the menu options from the beginning all the way to the end, and hopefully this isn't too boring for you. Image quality set to RAW. Pretty simple. I never use JPEG for anything unless it's accidental. Dual pixel RAW, not important unless you're shooting studio work or something really detailed. If you're a wedding or portrait photographer, it's not going to help. I believe that's what allows you in post-processing to take Canon images and adjust the focus just slightly later on, which I have no need to really do right now. Cropping. Okay, this is a big reason why this camera, specifically the EOS-R, was so great. It's the way they implemented in-camera cropping. So I keep this on full frame most of the time, of course, but I've got, and we'll get to this later, but one of these arrows is set to quickly let me be able to adjust in camera with just one button press, full frame or 1.6 DX crop, which is fantastic. Or I can go 1:1, 4:3. I don't really shoot any of the other options. It's either full or slightly cropped in. That gives me just so much more variety to make a decision in the moment in camera instead of having to post-process crop all the time. So I keep that on full, of course, to start with. Image review off, especially using live view and viewfinders. You see exactly what you're getting as you're getting it. So generally, I don't want to see it right back at me. That's just annoying. Shutter release without card, turn that off. I don't know why it doesn't come like that default out of the box. You don't want to accidentally be taking pictures with no memory card in the camera. All of this, I don't touch. I keep everything off. I don't want lens correction or anything being done in camera, not to mention, it's not going to matter if you're shooting RAW anyway. External speedlight control. We'll get to how I use my camera with a speedlight attached in just a moment, but here's just a view of it to see. I believe these are probably just the default settings if you want to take a look and compare. All right, getting into the more fun stuff. Exposure compensation, I'm going to keep that zeroed out. I do adjust for it if I use auto ISO for exposure. We'll get to that in a minute, but this is pretty key. ISO speed settings. Specifically for this camera, you go to ISO speed range. By default, this is actually set to 100, which is fine, but it's a little bit more convenient to shoot at 50. That way you can get just a little bit darker, especially if you're using a 1.2 aperture lens. That way, if you're shooting in bright sun, it gives you a little more headroom to not blow out your highlights if you can shoot at ISO 50. And then I adjusted the maximum to also be the absolute max. Auto range, 100 to 12,800 is fine. Works for me. Minimum shutter speed, I just keep it on auto. Light optimizer, turn that off. This is just like a shadow effect. If you shoot JPEG, it would matter. If you shoot RAW, it gets erased anyway, so don't worry about it. Highlight tone priority, off. Metering timer, 8 seconds. Exposure simulation, enable. This here during aperture preview is if you have a button set to give you an aperture preview, which I do, and we'll talk more about it in a minute, but exposure simulation just shows you as you change your settings what it looks like through your live view, just like you're seeing here as I adjust my shutter speed. One of the big flaws with this camera and any Canon camera with live view is that you can adjust your aperture, and depending on the light condition, it won't show you the aperture change without pressing a button. In this situation, it seems to be doing it. It's very weird, but if I hold the actual aperture preview button, I have a button set for that, Boom, now you can see what F13 actually looks like. It's a little bit of a mystery to me why I have to hold a button to see that, and it just doesn't show it as I change the setting. So it literally just does an exposure preview, does not change the actual aperture to follow along the way it does on every other camera that I believe is in the market. I don't know what's up with that, Canon. Okay, moving on. You want exposure simulation enabled. White balance, auto white balance. I pretty much always shoot with that. All of this sRGB, color picture style, standard. Long exposure noise reduction off. High ISO noise reduction off. None of that stuff matters unless you're saving JPEGs as well. Touch shutter, I disable that. Touch shutter just means it operates more like your iPhone where you just touch somewhere, it focuses and takes a picture. I know a lot of people love that feature for dance floor stuff, but I haven't found it very useful for me, so I keep it off. Multiple exposure, as needed. I have a shortcut to get to that quickly. We'll talk about that later. HDR mode off. Anti-flicker shoot, disable. It's going to be an issue. I believe it lets you know if flicker is being detected. Silent live view shooting, I keep it on mode 1 all the time. If you're in mode 2, it does actual, like you take the picture. Let's see if you can actually hear it. So, okay, it like splits it up. When you push the shutter down, it pauses, it closes the curtain, and then it doesn't open it again until you release. So it sounds like this. So it's very quiet, but it's really meant for like single shot shooting, which is fine. But I prefer mode 1, which sounds like this. Still quiet. And if I turn it off, let's compare. It almost sounds like 3 pictures are being taken. It's crazy. So I've had no real issue with mode 1. It's been perfectly fine. High-speed display on. So here we get into some of the more tricky stuff. AF operation. By default, I think the camera comes in 1 shot, but I prefer servo. You have to be in servo mode to get this sort of 3D spatial tracking that you see here. If I turn it off and I just go to 1 shot, you lose that. Here, it will do eye tracking, but it like auto tries to pick what's in focus for you, which I don't love. I really like having a set specific spot where I can always autofocus. So I keep it by default on servo, not 1 shot. And then the autofocus method, you have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different methods you can choose from. But I've disabled all but 2 of them. The 1-point autofocus and then the L plus tracking. L plus tracking is critical. That is exactly what's enabling that blue box. I can just start autofocusing on a subject and it'll track that subject as I get closer, further away, recompose, whatever I want. It'll stick with it. If it's a person's face, if it's a pile of books, whatever. And this is one reason why I don't understand what the big deal is about eye tracking, because there are so many, as a wedding photographer, you're focusing on so many other objects. Yes, if you have humans in the picture, it's nice to know that it'll lock on their eye, but what if you have multiple humans? Then you're picking between which eye you want in focus anyway. So I just start with the focus point on the subject or the eye or whatever that I want, and then recompose, and it'll track and follow, no problem. I find that far easier. So anyway, just for simplicity's sake, when I'm quickly selecting a focus mode, I've turned off everything other than these 2, which are the only 2 modes that I use. Okay, continuous autofocus is really interesting. So that just means if you have this enabled, it's gonna operate sort of like a video camera. Like as I recompose, whatever is on the focus point automatically gets focused on. So let's see. So this is actually something I turn on when I have a flash and I'm shooting dance floor stuff, and we'll get back to that in a second. But for the most part, I keep this disabled. I only engage autofocus when I half press the shutter. I'm one of those photographers that half press shutter to engage autofocus. Let's see, touch and drag. So this is a really innovative, interesting feature that Canon, I believe, is the only camera maker that has. Touch and drag. If you have it enabled, you can actually use, let's see, it may not do it when I'm recording the screen. I think it's a little upset that I'm like outputting to HDMI. But essentially the way it operates is if it's enabled and you're not recording a screen, you can touch the rear screen here and move that autofocus point. So wherever the square is now, wherever I touch, it'll move around like a virtual joystick is the best way I can describe it, which is pretty awesome if you're a fan of joysticks. Your left hand, which is normally just holding holding for balance anyway, can now have a thumb be really useful in using touch to drag. So I think that's pretty handy. I wish I could show it to you in this actual demo. Again, I don't know why it won't, but I don't use it that often, but it's really fascinating if again, you're a fan of joysticks and virtual joysticks. One subtle and maybe confusing thing, position method, absolute versus relative. So that's just saying if you touch in the upper left corner of this screen, it will start in the upper left corner. Relative means if you touch in the left corner, it'll start with where the focus point was originally and then move relative to the direction you go from there. So just a different way your brain might work, and you probably have a preference there, but I keep mine on absolute. Focus guide. So if this is on, it is, if you're manual focusing, it does this weird like triangle thing. The series here, you can see they like stack as I get in focus versus not. And it's really weird, and there we go. So they stack green if it's perfectly sharp. I don't see how that is better than focus peaking, which, will it show? Which I have turned off right now. I'm not sure if it'll work with this HDMI going out, but focus peaking is my superior preference. Yeah, it says not available when connected over HDMI. Go to manual focus peaking settings, turn it to whatever color you want. I put it on high sensitivity so it really shows up. All right, tracking. I keep it zeroed out by default. This may be something you want to switch if you're tracking something particularly high speed, like a car or a dog or an animal of some kind. But for me, in the most part, I keep these zeroed out. This, though, I do have boosted +1, and that's just the speed that you can move your autofocus point yourself around. So I just have that boosted 1. Lens electronic manual focus. I have this set to 1 shot, then enabled. AF assist beam firing on. That is this camera assist beam, which you definitely want on if you're shooting low light. 1 shot AF release. I have it set to release priority instead of focus priority. So it's going to err on the side of when I say release and take the shutter, it does it instead of waiting for it to get locked into focus. All right, lens drive when AF impossible on. Limit AF methods. Here's where I've set, remember when I showed all these focus methods, the different zones and stuff like that? I have all those turned off except for those two, L tracking and the one you can't turn off. AF linked. Okay, so this is just saying when you're in manual, link it. When you go vertical, also have a different frame of reference. So you can actually have it start in the upper third there, and then I can, let's see if I can I move it with HDMI out? I don't think I can. But essentially, this gives you 2 independent starting points depending on if you're shooting portrait or landscape mode. And you can see the focus point move as I rotate. So I do have that turned on. And I generally have it set to go in the upper third of a portrait picture as well. Initial servo point. I have this autofocus point set for all these various focus points. And that's it. Here, this is all default. I don't think I changed anything about playback. Nothing fancy here. Eco mode off, power saving, I think display off after 1 minute, auto power off 1 minute. Nothing fancy. I think that's all default. Beep, turn that off. This is my viewfinder display format. I keep it on the default, which is 1. And here's where we start to get into some of the more interesting customizations of the camera. Exposure level increments, mine's default, 1/3 of the stop increments. Same with ISO. Bracketing, all this is default, nothing too interesting there. I have spot metering set for auto exposure lock meter. My dial directions are, I think, all normal. Yeah, all normal dial directions. Here's where we get to some really tricky in-depth stuff. Button customization. So I have my shutter button set to engage autofocus and also meter. And I use spot metering most of the time. I've got my record, the red record button, set to do a depth of field preview, which is this, which is if you have your shutter stop down to f16, it actually shows you what f16 is. Again, I have the record button set to do that. This nice button, the manual function button here, I have set to magnify or reduce. So it essentially zooms. Now, you can't zoom when it's 3D tracking, which makes sense because it would be like flying all over the place and it would be a little confusing. So what I've got to enable that quickly is the next button down, my AF on button. So I'm really weird in the way I've got my camera set up. Where most people probably have the AF on button to actually engage autofocus, I have it turn autofocus off. And the reason I do that is because I can quickly hold that button, start moving the focus ring on my lens, and it immediately jumps to being like a manual focus experience. And then, to tie it all back, Once I'm in that zone, once I start manual focusing, I can hit this button here, the manual focus, and it will zoom in and magnify exactly where I want, in and out, so I can, you know, if I'm focusing on something really tricky, it's no problem. So that's probably the reverse of what most people should do. But again, I have my AF on. If I quickly need to focus on something manually because the camera just isn't getting it for whatever reason, or I'm shooting through something really complicated, I just hold the AF on button. It bumps it into manual as soon as I start focus ring adjusting. And then I can also get the focus peaking it automatically enables, or I can zoom in and magnify and get something super sharp, pop back out, take the picture, and be done. Simple as that. So that's a really, really important part of how I shoot and the entire experience that I love that this camera satisfies. Okay, the brightness button here, I have that set to maximize screen brightness, which means the live view screen, oftentimes it can be hard to see it in really bright outdoor sunlight. So if you hit that button, it'll artificially boost and brighten it so you can actually see if you need to check focus or something like that. It doesn't adjust the exposure value at all, it just boosts the brightness of the screen. So that's really handy. Okay, the mode button, that just does different mode adjustments from, I'm almost always in manual exposure mode. AF on, I already said, I have this actually set to autofocus off. And that little star there also means auto exposure is locked. So if I need to meter and recompose, if I'm holding that button, I know it's locked auto exposure too. This button, the upper part of my right thumb, switches the AF method. So it goes from, remember, I only enabled 2 autofocus methods. So what it's referring to are these. So I have the star button set to switch to toggle between L+ tracking and this other just one spot. So that's all it's doing. And the main reason for that is eye tracking and using a flash when I need. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. But that just lets me cycle through the AF buttons really quickly. And then this little rectangular dot thing, I have this set to rotate between one shot and servo. So that gives me, essentially gives me 3D tracking or eye tracking. I don't have a face to track, unfortunately, but if I did have a human head right now, you'd see it was actually tracking the human's eye. Let's see if it'll get this little guy's face. I doubt it. Come on, little guy. I have a tiny little face drawn on there, but it doesn't, it's not realistic enough. I guess my illustration skills just aren't up to the task. No eye tracking, but that's okay. So that gives me a 1-button option to go from 3D tracking to eye tracking instantly, from one shot to servo mode, sorry. Okay, on the lens itself, if it actually had a button, which this lens doesn't, I just have it do autofocus off again. Again, I don't think I actually have a lens where that button exists yet. Okay, so on the back, we have your circular upright, up, down, left, right. My up gives me all my flash functions. My left gives me dial function, which is this option here. And I quickly use that to adjust ISO. This camera has a weird sort of glitch, and I want a really quick way of getting from manual ISO to auto ISO quickly. And the glitch is the only way to quickly get to auto ISO is reliably is to hit that button and be in it. So I can, if I'm there, so I've hit the left button and I have all my ISO adjustments here. If I leave it on auto, I can start shooting, shoot. Adjust ISO using my lens, which is another customization we'll get to later, but the lens ring here I have set to adjust ISO. So I can be manually adjusting my ISO here, but then say I want to jump into auto instantly, I just hit the left button and I'm there. It automatically jumps there in 1 button press. So I found that really useful. So dial function. Okay, the right button is my Q menu, which is like, again, I referred to that earlier. I kind of keep it set on cropping in camera real quickly, so I can just do that with one button click real quick. But if you want to leave it on one of these, you can also jump in and out very quickly into some of these other more advanced settings. But most everything else in this menu, I keep untouched, or I have another button mapped to adjust. So I mostly use that to just get in-camera cropping really quickly back and forth. And The last one, I still haven't been able to decide what I want to use it for. I still have it just go back to flash functions. Now the big button in the middle, set, that's another ISO adjustment. Because I still use a lot of native Canon lenses that don't have the customizable ring here, if I throw on an older lens that doesn't have it, I still want an easy, quick, intuitive way to adjust ISO. So all I have to do is hold the set button and then I can adjust ISO quickly that way, and it's simple. So pause your way through that, play around and see what works for you. But those are exactly how I've got my custom buttons on the top and the bottom all assigned. All right. Customized dials. So I've got this dial adjusting aperture, this dial adjusting shutter, and then here I have the control ring. If the lens supports it, adjust my ISO speed. You can have that adjust a lot of other stuff. You can have it adjust your exposure compensation, shutter, aperture. It's really, really cool. But I keep it on ISO, and I found that to be really useful. Because otherwise my left hand is just sort of sitting there for balance anyway, so why not just use these fingers for something more advanced? This sucker, this manual control bar, kind of a waste of time. Unfortunately, it's just not implemented well from Canon. So I just have it set to white balance. Normally I shoot auto white balance. This lets me just dial in a quick, if I hold it, it allows me to do a quick, shade, whatever adjustment. But the auto white balance on this camera has been so great, I almost never even have to use the touch bar, MF bar thing. Shutter with release without lens. That is a critical thing to have on if you do any type of free lensing. Otherwise, when you remove your lens, it just won't let you take a picture. Turn that on. I think it's kind of fun to play with. And then that's it. Here's some of the quick, in the star menu here is where you can add quick stuff that you don't want to dive through the menu for. Exposure simulation, turning on and off, multiple exposure. So these are all pretty straightforward. Multiple exposure, I want to be able to get to that pretty quickly, turning it on and off. These are my typical settings for that. I actually usually do average 2. Continuous AF. Let's talk about this now. Let's say I attach a flash. So I have a very different combination of focus modes when I have a flash attached. One of the things I really like about this camera is when it detects you've got a flash, it auto exposes. So the exposure preview, what you're seeing will not change no matter what your settings are. Okay, and the reason it does that and why it's so useful is you can be in really low light and it'll auto expose it to be brighter. So it can actually focus track using the high ISO capability of the sensor. It won't actually shoot at that high ISO, but it will focus track much, much easier. It's kind of hard to show you unless I just put my hand over the lens. You can see it auto exposes to be bright, even though I'm not changing any camera settings. So if I turn the flash off, it'll stop doing that. Flash is off, it tracks as you would expect. Exposure simulation, I turn the flash on. Now, no matter what my settings are, it automatically brightens up. Again, so this is super useful in really low light. If you're using flash, it'll face track, it'll eye track and do all that using the high ISO capabilities, and then ultimately take the picture at the exposure you want. So some of the focus modes that I use, when I have a flash, I turn servo off, I shoot one shot, and I toggle between using the focus point and using the autofocus point. And that just means it'll eye track most of the time. So if I've got my flash attached, I'm holding the camera up really high like this, using the screen from a really high angle, and it's just eye tracking constantly for me. And it'll just lock on to someone's face. And it's for shameless, easy dancing photos. I don't have to think about it much. It just focuses on whatever person's face is most prominent and clear. Boom, I take a picture of them dancing. I used to really want particular control over the focus point with dancing, but I found this to be a much easier solution. And that's it. When I hit the up button, remember that gives me my quick control adjustments. You can, in the camera body, quickly adjust your flash power. And I typically shoot first curtain sync manual power. I'll link to this video, refer back to my bounce flash tutorial for how I actually expose and meter and set my flash settings. That will still apply even though I'm using a new camera system. But for the most part, that's it. There's nothing else too quirky that I've done in this camera body except the lock button. I have set that to lock controls so that I've just noticed if the screen is out like this and my face is right up against it, if the controls aren't locked, it'll sometimes try and move the focus point. And again, I always want my focus point to be here, the center upper third part of the frame. That just works for my brain. That's generally, if you're photographing people, where someone's eyes and face are going to be first as a more pleasing composition in the upper third part of the shot, instead of starting right in the center of the frame. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm sure there's going to be a ton of questions. Follow up in the comments for sure if you have any, and let me know if you figured out something about specifically the Canon EOS-R or anything else in your settings that you really like. But at the end of the day, 90% of the time, if I'm not using flash, this is what I see on the back of my camera. Servo mode, 3D tracking, I half press the shutter, it turns on autofocus, and I can recompose, and it'll not lose sight of where my intentional focus point was supposed to be. So I hope you found that really interesting and helpful. Hit me up in the comments. We just have to hit the next milestone of patrons, and this camera will be the winners. So that's it. Thanks, everyone.